meaner experience. I'm Karen Ryan. I'm part of the business development team in the Cambridge Assessment English Dubai office. First, I'd like to thank our sister organisation, Cambridge University Press, for inviting us to be part of this superb initiative, and to warmly congratulate Peter, Luke and Tony for putting together such a rich and varied programme. It's really exciting to see so many educators coming together virtually to share in this professional development event. You know, we're living through probably the strangest and most challenging experience of all our lifetimes. So this is such a wonderful opportunity to connect and grow, and remember that as educators, we're a strong community that's united in our vocational purpose. As an organisation, we are dedicated to helping people learn English and prove their skills to the world. And critical to that mission is supporting every teacher. As such, we're thrilled to be part of this initiative, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar, The Practical Approach to Learning-Oriented Assessment, delivered by my Cambridge Assessment English colleague, Professor Hisham Al-Sagbini. Dr. Hisham is our Regional Recognition and Assessment Services Manager at Cambridge Assessment English. He holds a bachelor's in business, a master's in strategy and development, and his doctoral thesis was on inclusiveness in education and bridging the underachievement gap in higher education in the UK. Dr. Hisham brings more than 15 years of international experience in the higher education sector and has over 80 different publications in the UK and Europe in the areas of education and research, inclusion, and assessment. Today, he'll be focusing his webinar on practical classroom techniques and formative assessment. Before I hand over, please let me share some housekeeping. Everyone's microphones will be muted, but you can use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout the presentation. The chat box can be used to post answers and engage in the interactive parts of the session. And during the last 10 minutes, we will read out as many of your questions as we can. On the last slide of Dr. Hisham's presentation, there'll be a QR code, which when scanned will produce a certificate of attendance. We'll also post a link in the chat box, which you can copy and paste in case you can't scan the QR code. And finally, the recordings will be made available and will be emailed to you at a later date. And with that, let me pass over to Dr. Hisham for what promises to be a very insightful session on formative assessment. Happy learning, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks, Peter, as well for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, really, for tuning in today. It's really a pleasure to be talking to you today about one of the presentations that basically we really enjoy delivering. My name is Hisham Al-Sagbini, and I'm basically specialized in inclusive education, and obviously that's the theme that underpins the whole concept that I'll be talking about today. So I hope really in this presentation you will get some, it will ignite some interest on what learning-oriented assessment is all about and how you can apply it online and offline, because there are lots of practical aspects to it. In this presentation, I'll be talking about two things. I will start first of all with the concept of learning, as we tend to analyze it, and then we will focus on some effective characteristics of learning, and then we will highlight how we can use assessment for the sake of effective learning. And eventually we'll look at some tools that we can incorporate practically in our practices in the classroom. So that's the plan for the day. That should take us for around 50 minutes. And in these 50 minutes, there will be a few questions. So I really hope that you will be able to interact with the content as I'm hoping for. Let me just start my presentation. And obviously, the main reason why we're doing this, why we're focusing on effective education, on effective assessment, and the use of assessment now in our research, is really promoting the essence of relevance to learning. And I'm sure many people that are listening to us today would agree that the most important aspect of learning is to be able to apply it, to be able to use it in our daily lives. And particularly, one of the most important features of effective learning is developing skills that can be developed, that can be utilized out of the classroom. And ultimately, that's the ultimate objective. That's the main objective for all this work that we're doing. How can we make our work in the classroom more relevant to our learners? So the notion, the underpinning notion that basically I need to focus on is relevance. And I'll go back to the term relevance in a minute. To make our work more relevant, we have to understand, where does actual learning take place? Where does it really happen? We need to understand the context of learning. We need to understand the challenges, we need to understand the opportunities, we need to understand the enablers, etc., etc. And that's where the starting point lies. How can we basically initiate a learning process if we are not able to identify where this learning takes place? So in order to understand the context, we have to start with the learner. We have to understand the individual needs of our learners. We have to understand how these learners are able to collect, use, analyze, and synthesize the data that we share. So with all these different terms in mind, the first question in my mind is, how do we really learn? How do we really kind of capture all these different terms practically? And what are the characteristics of learning? How can we identify that learning is taking place? These questions are fundamental to what we'll be talking about in a minute. How do we learn? And what are the characteristics of learning? And if we reflect for a minute, I'm sure many of us around this room are able to identify or highlight some of these questions, or some of these points. How do we learn? How does learning take place? And what are the characteristics of learning that we need to look for when we are trying to assess if our learning process has been successful or not? One of the main approaches that basically I personally did a lot of work around is the holistic approach to learning. The learning journey that takes place in the classroom and out the classroom. We all, as learners, as human beings, develop various characteristics of learning from birth. That's how we learn how we speak. That's how we learn how we behave. So that means we have to really kind of reflect on our personal experiences first. And that's one of the main things that we always try to focus on, how to become really reflective practitioners. We need to assess how we learn, not what we need to learn. We need to understand the mechanism, the process. And this is actually a problem that we always face in various contexts, in various scenarios. How can we make sure that our learners are able, particularly in these times? I mean, if we are thinking of online learning, if we are thinking of the online context of learning, how can we ensure that our learners are technically self-regulated, are able to prioritize, are able um, to focus, to stay tuned, to most importantly, be motivated to learn? So these terms or these questions are practically relevant these days more than ever. How can we ensure that our learners are self-regulated learners? There are many questions in my head. There are many questions that basically we need to look for some basic answers for. You know what I mean? So ultimately, this is the overall theme that we are trying to focus on. So let me start with each one of these questions and let's try to answer them. The first one is, how do we learn? How do we make sure that our learning is taking place? I will go back to the 60s. Dale, in his work, I'm sure that basically many people that are listening to us today got acquainted with Dale's work one way or another. Dale, interestingly, in his cone of learning theory, he proposed a structure. And he says that basically, ultimately, the more engaged we are, the more involved we are with the learning process, the more knowledge we will retain afterwards. According to Dale, then ultimately the characteristic of learning is how much knowledge we retain. And Dale talked about the concept of active learning as a fundamental pillar for learning, for effective learning. Dale says that 90% of the work that we take part in, that we say or do, if we are basically involving more more participation into the learning process, is remembered 2 weeks after finishing a program or reading a book. Of course, many would argue against the process or the numbers that basically Dale brought in. But what's really interesting, what's relevant to us in this discussion is that there is an evidence now in our hands that basically effective involvement will lead to effective learning. But according to Dale, and that's really a very interesting point that we can analyze further, the most important indication of effective learning is remembering knowledge. And obviously, I'm not going to really kind of go into theories and the different arguments, but just an interesting idea that Kolb, on the other hand, I'm sure many of you got acquainted with the exponential learning theory of Kolb, that he talked about the transformation of knowledge. And they basically insist that knowledge is simply transforming our personal experiences. The way we transform our experience is the way we create knowledge. So, in other words, if I'm involved in a practical experiment, I will be able to generate or to discover learning. And that's another interesting notion. Learning discovery is the newest buzzword that basically we hear in research these days. It's opposed to learning engagement or opposed to teaching. So if you notice with me the paradigm shift that basically we witnessed over the years from the concept of teaching as a pedagogical approach to the concept of learner engagement, where most of the emphasis is on the learner, to the discovery model, to the fact that our learners are encouraged to discover knowledge and retain that knowledge. So the most important element that I can extract here is obviously that there are various forms of characteristics that we have to look for when we're dealing with an unusual context like online learning, for example. The first and the most important to me personally is engagement. Second is really the desire to take part in an action or in an activity or in an assignment or in a homework, motivation. And then the third element is the ability to analyze, the ability to synthesize. The thinking component is crucial for me in terms of highlighting these characteristics. So if I am to summarize, then the first element that I want to take away from this presentation is that basically, to us, the effective characteristics of learning are three: the engagement of the learner, the motivation of the learner, and the thinking of the learner. That's our first takeaway. I'll come back to this in a minute. How do we really kind of elaborate, and how can we make sure that these characteristics are displayed? how can we make sure that my learner that's listening to me over a webinar or over a presentation is actually engaged? One example of this is play. So when dealing with school children, for example, playing or games are an integral part of learning. Playing is one of the most obvious attempts for engaged learning. It has various characteristics. It is active, it involves exploration, it promotes the discovery model that we're talking about, it promotes open-ended thinking and spontaneous thinking, and it motivates the learner to be more engaged. So then the first component that I want to emphasize on is playing. The discovery context of learning is promoted through games, through various forms of activities. Another important element is really the aspect um, of how we promote that sense of or how do we promote that sense of engagement. One of the theories that I would like to throw here, and I'm sure many people around this online platform got acquainted with, is Carl Dweck's work over developing a growth mindset using the feedback that we give to our learners. Carl Dweck, a couple of years back, published a number of research findings on developing growth mindset among learners through various forms of activities. So these activities are crucial because in a minute I will be replacing them with assessments. So let's remember this idea. Carl Dweck said that basically we can increase learners' engagement by utilizing a form of developing a form of growth mindsets among our learners. And developing a growth mindset is simply a result of making sure that learning is or praise or feedback on learning is given on the work or the hard work that these learners are displaying, not the intelligence, not a static feature in the learning process. So the most important element that Carl Dweck talked about is how can we ensure that the feedback that we're providing to our learners is developing a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. I'll park that notion there. Another important thing is putting everything together. So the type of activity that's given to our children in schools and the type of exercises and how we can capitalize on these elements using the feedback that we provide, put together in one context, which requires, we will see in a minute, some sort of standardization. So the ability for me to standardize my work in the classroom is a key feature. So how can we ensure then our learners that are studying now in these unusual circumstances are effective learners? There is plenty of activities going on. There's plenty of support to nurture their interests. And most importantly, there is emphasis on the discovery learning model. And for the discovery learning model, there are various attempts in various schools of thought how this can be portrayed in an online context. And one of my research interests now is to really see the impact or assess the impact on learner achievement. So I'll leave these ideas with you for a minute because that's really important for the flow of ideas until we feed into the target that we want to reach to. So that means in the entire context that we are analyzing, then we have to reconsider how learning takes place in its context. We have to analyze four different realms, four different worlds that intersect. We've got the personal world, and that's basically where learning um, is stored or retained. And that's my personal cognitive abilities. That's my knowledge, my competencies, my strategies, my approaches, etc. And that's interacted with the subject content, with the curriculum, with the syllabus, etc. And then, even if we are working in an online context, there's a very important social variable to be included in the learning process. And then finally, the standardized element of the process, which is the assessment. That means if we are basically looking at a successful learning process, we have to consider these four worlds interacting together. These four worlds interacting to generate learning. And in this context, as we said, we have two types of learning. The formal learning, which is passed formally through the materials, the content, the course guidelines, etc., etc. That's a formal type of learning. And then we have the natural acquisition of learning. And the natural acquisition is a result of our interaction with peers, with colleagues, etc. And for us really to focus on the formal learning only is really technically ignoring a very important element that we have to always emphasize on. So what I'm emphasizing in this presentation on is the fact that let's assess the context that learning takes place in. That's my first question that I asked. And we looked at various elements into it. We looked at various theories and ideas of how learning takes place. We looked at the characteristics of learning. I only emphasize on the engagement because that's really relevant in this context, especially when we have now limited time for this webinar. So that means it's up to us right now, really, to analyze the context of each one of our classrooms, our virtual classrooms, and really kind of draw conclusions on how best to approach them. To summarize, then, we've got four intersecting worlds that basically we deal with in an online environment. We've got the personal world, we've got the educational world, we've got the social, and we've got the assessment. And learning then is the direct and indirect interaction between these four realms. So how do we really capitalize on this? How do we really make sure that there is always learning taking place at every step of the process? Let's hold that notion for a minute. Let's just basically park this aside and look into the next diagram. This is a practical example of our practical sketch our classrooms, be it online classroom or a physical classroom. We've got examples of various levels of influence within our classes. In the diagram in front of us on the screen, we've got four boxes. The first one, the red one, represents the external influence, the strategy, the government decisions, etc., etc., which we as educators have some sort of indirect influence over, but obviously not substantial. At lower level, we've got the green box, which represents our schools where we operate. It represents the fact that basically in these contexts, we do have some control. And then inside the green box, we've got two other boxes. And that's really, really interesting thing that I would really invite you all to analyze. In a classroom, in a typical classroom, we don't have one box all the time. We do have two boxes. We have the box where the teacher and the majority of the students are located. And even in that box, not all of them are the same level. Technically, people have different cognitive skills. People have different abilities. People have different approaches to learning, etc. But nonetheless, we do have various levels. We do have various learners that are sometimes, and in many cases, are taking a step back, not very much engaged, not very much involved, and not very much motivated to learn. The starting point of most of our work is to focus on the first notion, which is making sure that our learning is responding to the needs of each individual. And responsiveness to the ability of our learners means basically we are taking into account we know their abilities, we know their strengths, and we know their weaknesses. And that also means that we are aware of the learning patterns and preferences of each one of them. This is a very important point. And this is a very interesting thing that I personally spend a lot of time analyzing over the years. How can we make sure that the people or the learners that are left in the blue box are included in the purple one? There are various notions and various ideas and various approaches to this. But today, what I want to focus on is one particular element, is utilizing assessment, utilizing our own tools to make sure that our learning is responsive, our learning is individualized, i.e., I'm able to respond to the needs of my learners one learner at a time. To do this properly, let's do some analysis of the concept of these tools that we analyze. So, just to summarize, to reinforce what I just said, there are various ideas, there are various theories on how to include everybody in the learning process. Today, I chose to focus on one. Today, I chose to focus on assessment as a learning tool. Today, I chose to use assessment not as a standardized tool at the end of the course or at the end of the program, but as a learning tool that we can utilize during the learning process. So how can we do that? In order to understand this well, we have to analyze the word assessment, as this is our tool. That's basically what we are utilizing. So let's think a little bit deeper of what the word assessment means. But before we do that, let me summarize what I just said from the beginning of the past half an hour. I was saying that technically learning, to be effective, we must be studied in a context, must be analyzed within a specific context, and this context is the starting point of our analysis. And we looked at the effective characteristics of learning. We looked how can we make our learning more effective? How can we make sure that our learners are able to make this work more useful to them, more practical, and as such, in brackets, more relevant. And we looked at the term engagement, motivation, and thinking, as these are the crucial characteristics of learning. The tools, I said, there are hundreds of tools, hundreds of theories, and thousands of research papers that looked at the concept of inclusiveness and effective learning. I chose today to look at the classroom box. And in the classroom box, we said our main objective is to use one tool, pick one tool that we can use to make sure that our learning is more individualized and as such as more effective. So that means the starting point or the starting point of this analysis is understanding the concept of assessment. So what makes a good assessment? We specialize in language, so most of my examples will focus on languages, will focus on English language assessment and the tools that can be incorporated as such. Now, of course, if I'm browsing, if I'm looking for answers, there would be various ideas. So in the chat box, just as we speak, if you can basically give me a few ideas of what effective assessment mean? Or probably towards the end, I'm not sure where you can see the questions. Then obviously we can always look into the concept of good assessments in various eyes. We can always look into the concept of effective assessments in various levels. But in English, I try to summarize some of these ideas. Assessments must be covering all 4 skills, must be motivating, must be easy to integrate into curriculum, must be recognized, most importantly, must be relevant, must be fair and useful. Some of the characteristics that I gathered from various encounters with teachers. But you can, of course, come up with your own list of what makes a good assessment. So, in general, in our context, for the sake of this discussion and for the sake of developing tools for effective learning, then we have to look at some key concepts in assessment. The first one is validity. And in validity we mean that basically our assessments should have a clear purpose, should have clear test takers, should be reliable, should have a clear construct, should have clear tasks, and should have an impact. Summarize each one of them. The test purpose. Why am I testing? That's my first question. And if we are to analyze, there are various answers that we can get. Some of the answers that I got from various encounters: to check learning at the end of a unit, to diagnose if learning is actually taking place or not. For placement purposes, some interesting results that I got related to certification, etc. So we've got various types of reasons why our tests are used. And I'm not talking about standardized tests. I'm talking about any test that's thrown in a classroom context. So the first question that I'm asking myself is, why am I testing? Second question that I'm asking myself is, who am I testing? Who am I testing? Obviously, this should be a very clear answer, because as a teacher of a classroom, you should be aware of not only the level of the learner, not only the level of the English proficiency, but also the individual types of learning, the problems that they face, the challenges that they encounter. And how can I make sure that my test is reliable? And obviously, in English language, there are various ways of improving reliability of tests. One of the questions that was thrown here in this discussion is what's the CFR? And the quick answer to that, I'm sure many people around this room got acquainted with the term CFR. It's a common European framework for reference, which is a standardized tool that's used to relate learning to a specific scale. So now we have more standardization in the approach to learning. We have more standardization as such to the assessment that's used to that as part of that learning. Go back to the construct, which is really the what in the whole process. What am I testing? Am I focusing on a specific element? Am I focusing on pronunciation? Am I focusing? What do I want to test? So the construct in this context refers to the ability of what the test tries to measure. These are some basic questions that we can ask ourselves before we throw a test to our learners. Lastly, there's a very interesting buzzword that's tossed around a lot these days, which is the test impact. Let's think of how can I ensure how my test is actually benefiting my learners. Let's analyze for a minute when before we throw a test in a classroom context on how is this test useful to learners. And obviously this usefulness is embodied in various forms through measuring, through including all skills, or through the type of feedback that we provide on performance. Like we just said earlier, we are basically increasing effectiveness, we are increasing engagement, or through some relevant tasks that are basically related to their work, etc., etc. And that impact varies from one level to another. So if we are basically dealing with school children, that impact varies a great deal from learners in universities, for example. But it's always the same mechanism. It's always the same criteria of how we can ensure that learning is beneficial to our learners. One of the ways of doing that is really going a step back. So one of the things that basically I want to focus on now is just collecting everything we just said. I'm not going to add anything new to what I just said, but let's reflect. So based on the previous discussion, then there are certain types of assessments that are thrown. Some of them are used during the learning process, others are used at the end of the process. But obviously, we all know that perhaps whatever we use in our learning process, in brackets, more formative approach, is the type of learning that we will encourage, that we will use technically to ensure that learning is actually taking place. It's the first indicator that we use to assess if learning is actually happening or not. However, Dylan Williams, actually one of the great scholars at the University of London, uh, uh, brings a very interesting notion to the concept of assessment or formative assessment. And he says that basically assessment only becomes formative, useful to the learner, when it pushes me as a teacher to meet the needs of my learners. In other words, what he's trying to say is that basically the first step in making these assessments effective is to know exactly what the needs of our learners are. We do have a challenge, though. I'm sure many of you can guess what these challenges are. The challenge, basically, especially in an online context, is how really to equip young learners with some social elements, with some social skills that need to be utilized afterwards. That means the emphasis we always have is on the communication abilities that can be used in the real world. It's a given now in these days that ultimately English is a basic skill for all different professions. So how can we ensure that learning or that English really is effective in terms of what we do in the classroom? The main challenge, of course, is raising the English language level among school children, raising standards. Based on some of the research that took place in Europe last year, it indicates that the majority of school children have between A2 and B1 in the English language level. The challenge really is always to raise it to B2 level before graduating from school. So that means, obviously, we have to look into the concepts of learning the concept of assessment in a different view. So obviously, when we're talking about summative assessment, we're talking about formative assessment, we're talking about assessment for learning and assessment of learning. So we're talking about assessment for the learning process to ensure that the learning process is taking place, to ensure that there is a rapport, to ensure that there is engagement, etc. And then traditionally, we've got the assessment, the summative assessment, where we have assessment of learning. At the end of a program, at the end of a course, we measure how much knowledge you retained, and as such, we give you a grade, or we basically place you on a specific level. So on both levels, then, in both ideas, we've got one focus, which is learning, but one of them is for learning and the other is of learning. New notion that basically we're throwing now to increase inclusion in a classroom, to increase more responsiveness and more individualized learning, is the third one, is to look to look at assessment as learning. So the concept here then is to make sure that the learning process is, the assessment process is part of the learning mechanism. So whatever types of assessments that we basically introduce are related to the learning concept. And this is really what we mean by the learning oriented approach. So it's technically developing that particular systematic relation between formative types of assessment and linking them with a large scale type standardized tool. But how can we do that? How can we basically look into elements of our work where learning is more relevant, and more effective? Starting point when we are thinking of a course or a program should always be the learning outcomes of the program. In the learning outcomes, we always driving all the types of formative and summative questions. So in this context, then we have to utilize various tools and various levels. I mentioned at the beginning that basically in English language, we'd always have a reference. We always have a framework for reference, and that's what I'll be using in my illustrations. It's called the CFR, for those who are not familiar with it. The CFR breaks English language levels into various categories, starting from A1 all the way to C2, into three major groups: basic learner, basic user, independent user, and proficient user. In each one of these levels, we've got level descriptors. And in these level descriptors, we've got certain can-do statements. These are technically the learning objectives of any English language program for that level. That's the whole idea. So that means the learning-oriented curriculum looks into the can-do statements for each level. And if we are developing that framework in a more effective way, then we will utilize the concepts of developing a framework, comprehensive framework with these learning objectives in mind, into practical tasks that are given in various classroom contexts. And we've got internal evaluations and we've got external evaluations. So how will that work? Let's take a look at this practical example. In a typical English language program, in a typical English language course, we will always start with the level descriptors. We'll always start with whatever the level is, from A1 all the way to C2. We will put the learning objectives in a specific order based on the can-do statements and the level descriptors. We will design our learning-oriented course. And as I said, for each one of these learning objectives, we've got certain tasks given. These tasks are given to groups of learners or individualized or individual learners. Then The role of the teacher is to observe. The role of the teacher is to observe how not only the learning process taking place, but the interaction, the other social skills that basically we said is essential and to make our work more relevant. We interpret the results. We keep the results in a record, informal record, and then eventually we provide feedback to the learners in a cycle. This simple cycle that we have on the screen highlights a very basic learning-oriented process. It seems very simple. It seems very straightforward. But there are various models of applying this context. One of the most effective, really, is looking at the flipped classroom model. In the flipped classroom model, and I will invite everybody really to have a look at how the flipped classroom model operates, is simply a practical embodiment of learning-oriented tasks in practice. Taking a specific activity with the teacher guidance to record results and feedback into the learner. If this cycle is repeated multiple times, then we've got a complete record of achievement that will feed into the course and that will feed into developing the learning objectives and placing the learner at the right level. So the learning-oriented framework that we came up with is a very simple mechanism then, but very effective and very efficient. It starts with a standardized tool, a standardized framework. As such, it is the CFR in our context. And from that, we drive our courses, our learning objectives. We devise tasks, and these tasks are given to learners. And obviously, these results are recorded, and we end up with a record of achievement. Now, to look at this practically, we have various forms, various elements that we can incorporate. We can basically extract. So, I've got a complete learning-oriented syllabus that's driven per level from the CFR. I've got a record of achievement that feeds into the end of course results or end of course achievement record. We've got various tools that need to be incorporated. To do this effectively, we have to incorporate technology. Because without technology, this particular cycle looks and sounds very complicated. So taking learning at specific smaller chunks and making utilizing assessments as the driver for learning, utilizing the discovery model that we talked about, which, as we discussed at the beginning, is the most effective way. That means ultimately, based on everything we discussed, we are able to ensure that our learning is effective. But in theory, this is quite straightforward. The practicality of it is quite complicated if we don't utilize technology. So how can we basically utilize technology? Through our platforms, of course, and I'll breeze through some of these different descriptors to talk about some interesting tools that can be incorporated for this quest. In terms of English language, I think one of the most effective elements, one of the most effective tools that we always promote, that we always highlight, that go hand in hand with the concept of learning-oriented assessment is writeandimprove.com. Many of you around the room are very familiar with the concept, with this application. Write and Improve is an app designed to promote learning-oriented assessment. I can utilize it effectively based on my level descriptors on the can-do statements. So if you're not at this example that I have for a writing task, for example, A2 provides me with a can-do statement. So can write short, simple notes, can give short, basic descriptions, etc., etc. For B1 is the same thing. For B2 is the same thing. So B2 got more sophisticated skills that are incorporated in the writing. So I will invite everybody around the room to take a look at Write and Improve. That's how it looks like. It provides various writing examples and writing tasks. Another interesting tool that you will find really, really useful in this quest is the digital teacher. And the digital teacher is a platform that really looks into your digital skills, how basically you can incorporate various learning elements in your own quest and look at various types of questions.
Hisham, sorry to interrupt. Just to let you know, you've got about 4 or 5 minutes left.
All right, thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, no problem.
Again, looking at some of the resources that can be incorporated in Empower. I'm sure many of my colleagues talked about Empower in a bit of details. It breaks it down into smaller chunks. It's a practical example of learning-oriented assessment. So that's a really useful tool for a learning-oriented assessment. Now, I think I did very well with time. So the only thing that that I wanted to do at the end really is to summarize the main points that I threw. So the entire theme that basically I was trying to focus on is promoting a more effective use of our assessments in the classroom using various tools. And we looked basically that learning-oriented assessment depends on technology a great deal. So we've got record keeping, we've got feedback, we've got blended learning, we've got um, um, different types of profiling for learners, and we've got ownership and motivation. The practicality of this is really diverse. So to look at the model of learning-oriented assessment in a greater details, it takes you into various models of delivery that can be incorporated in your classes. But I would strongly invite everybody to have a look at or to do some research on flipped classroom techniques and how they basically can utilize using assessments, standardized assessments for a learning discovery model. So in this quest, then we've got three main pillars that go hand in hand: learning, assessment, and technology. So our triangle that basically we're always focusing on is making sure that assessment is used for learning and it's supported by technology all the time. The only point that that I would really encourage everybody to do, if you're interested in knowing more about assessments and learning-oriented assessment, we've got a large number of applications available for download, and I'll invite you really to look at our journals, studies in language testing or research matters. They have various papers. I quoted some of them here. So please have a look. And that brings me really to the end of my presentation. I really hope that I managed to give you something that's useful, something that's practical in your own classroom teaching. I think we still have about 7 minutes. I was told that we need to leave the last 10 minutes for questions and answers. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Hisham. That was an amazing presentation. I don't know how, if you were able to read any of the comments in the chat box, but some really very, very grateful comments, very supportive. Everybody's saying how much they enjoyed it. If you wouldn't mind, a few questions I've picked up during the session.
Sure.
One of the ones that came up a couple of times is whether or not you could briefly explain the difference between an active learner and an effective learner. This was something you talked about at the beginning of your session.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
So for active learning, I based the discussion of active learning based on Dale's model. Dale's model goes back to the 60s. So Dale highlighted a very important notion in the learning process itself. So Dale was saying that an effective learner is an active learner is a learner that's taken part directly in the learning process, i.e., participating in examples, in activities, in an experiment. So that means there is some sort of a physical involvement in the learning process. I can give my learners various levels of activities and tasks where they can do on their own, or a role play, or a specific experiment, or to sing a song, or perform a play, etc. So that type of learning is an active learning where the learner is utilizing various types of senses. An effective learner, however, is a type of learner that's able to become a self-regulated learner, and also able to um, utilize or make use of the time of the resources that are available effectively. So active learning is part of the learning process itself. Effective learning is two levels. One involves the teacher or the school or the system by promoting certain elements, and the other is promoting self-regulated learning.
Okay, great. So I suppose an effective learner also has to be an active learner.
Oh, absolutely.
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 Yeah.
One of the main characteristics of effective learning is
Sure.
engagement. To be engaged with learning, and to be engaged, that technically means you have to be involved,
Yeah.
i.e.
Okay.
active.
Great, thank you. Another question, if I may, obviously very relevant to the current crisis that we're moving through, but quite a few people here today have been saying, how can we ensure engagement during online learning? Because I think probably a lot of what you were referring to was face-to-face, but does it also apply to the situation we're in now, where we're doing everything online?
That's a great question, and I'm asked this question many times. And I think the challenge that we always face with the online context really is that social factor. However, one of the notions, one of the most frequent ideas that I effectively utilized in online context is the flipped classroom, really. In the flipped classroom, the idea is to make sure that the role of a teacher is to be converted from dictating, from providing information, from showing exactly what needs to be done, to a discovery model. So place more emphasis on the learner, on the learners themselves, to be able to extract knowledge and discover knowledge on their own and show the evidence. The evidence is actually the result or the outcome that basically you would seek to achieve. Answering this question really requires a lot of examples and a lot of time. But in brief, I would only say that in online context doesn't really differ much from a face-to-face context in terms of the tools, mechanisms, and theories. The only thing basically we need to bear in mind is that the center of the learning process is the learner. So if I'm basically placing that learner in a discovery context where they are able to discover learning and transform that type of learning into knowledge, then I would have achieved, and I would have managed to increase my learner engagement. But I have to admit that basically answering this question in a few minutes is a bit challenging for me.
Of course, yeah. Well, but thank you for trying. I think we've got time for one more very brief answer. My next question was actually going to be, what is the flipped classroom? But I think you've just explained that. So the last question, you're going to like this one, Hisham. Where can we find online assessment?
Oh, perfect.
I knew it would be.
Well, obviously, whoever asked this question came to the right place, because there are various levels. There are various levels of tools that are available. I mean, we at Cambridge provide a large number of resources and tools to enable learners in these contexts. I mean, one of our newest tests, LinguaSkill, has recently become as well available to direct customers. So learners can actually enjoy using this test at the comfort of their homes. LinguaSkill is actually one of the most advanced tests that utilize artificial intelligence and can be incorporated quite effectively in any learning process. So the first answer is have a look at our website, and you will be able to discover the large number of resources that are available. LinguaSkill is top of the list. That's basically one of our standardized tests that utilize artificial intelligence. I mentioned a few of them actually during the process. Write and improve for specific writing tasks could be really, really handy. We've got lots of other resources that are available that will enable learners to make the most of the online resources. But I'm sure that basically through you, Peter, or through direct communication, would be able to share, at least the links to some of our assessments that are available.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much again, Hisham, for giving up your time this afternoon. I know the audience has really enjoyed it. We've got 3,000 people in the room, the maximum that we can actually have, unfortunately. Many more were trying to join us, but thank you once again, and we look forward to inviting you back for another webinar in the future. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Okay, I can see lots of questions, of course, about the survey. So my colleague Raz will put the QR code on the screen and also a link. You can scan the QR code, you can follow the link,